I'm Caroline Goodson. I am an early medieval historian. I'm a fellow and I'm a university senior lecturer in the history faculty. I joined King's 5 years ago, I think now. I taught at University of London before that. And this was to have been a double act. This was to have been a joint presentation between myself and our research fellow, Katie Haworth, who is working on late Roman and early medieval Britain, and particularly this site. But she felt unwell this morning and very wisely took a COVID test and tested positive. So she is at home in bed. I took a COVID test this morning. I have not tested positive, so I am here. And I will do what I had intended to do, which is present to you the background for this project and some of the kind of wider historical and archaeological context of thinking about early medieval Britain. And then Katie has very generously sent me some notes to speak to what she would have wanted to introduce to you today about some particular case studies of individual graves. And I'm also going to be able to show you a little bit. We've got some of the iron objects here that I can show you. You'll see them in the images, and then I can speak to them as well. And then we wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. So I'll move quickly just to help you sort of understand what we're talking about. So very briefly, we are talking about a site here. Croft Gardens is there, sort of just east of the intersection between the Grange Road and the Barton Road. And this is a site that some of you may have known from your time at King's before. There were a series of houses there for graduates and fellows, and there were some bungalows built in the early 20th century, and they really had outlived their purpose, and they didn't meet the needs of the college any longer. And so the college undertook to create new housing at the site. And as with anyone who wants to build a new building in England, we as a property developer are obliged to look at the potential archaeological damage that a new building might cause. And so there was a desk-based assessment, and I think everyone probably, more than others, but everyone had a pretty good idea that there was going to be an early medieval cemetery here. I'm showing you here a passage from Cyril Fox's really excellent, and really quite old now, but really excellent study of the archaeology of the Cambridge region, in which he identifies that people have been finding elements of pertaining to early medieval burials in this area around Newnham Croft. And indeed, it appears on his map, and it was recognized by the Historic England site, so as a potential site. There's quite a lot of stuff that's in the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology that comes from the site. And one of the things that's really quite interesting about this is that the first director of the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology was a Polynesianist. He was an anthropologist who was quite interested in working in Pacific Islands, but he lived at Croft Gardens. And he sort of poodled around in his garden and found various bits, as did neighbors. So here in 1936, someone found a grave set of objects, these, which very, very clearly date from the 6th century, and donated them and found them sort of on her property in this area. So these are all objects that pertain most likely to the same burial ground that we're talking about today. But they're sporadic finds. No one has systematically studied the site. It's just things have come up as people have been planting their rose bushes, or Baron von Hugel was poodling around in his back garden and finding things. And no one has considered it systematically until now. So when the ground was broken for the new building, as would be entirely appropriate for a site that's been designated as of high potential for archaeological finds, a team of commercial archaeologists went in to investigate the site. And so here they are on site. Albion Archaeology did the project, and they are commercial archaeologists. So this is what they do professionally. They come in, they identify all of the archaeological remains, they record them in a systematic way, and then they leave. And they leave the site for the builders. So here's the site as it was being excavated. The bungalows have been cleared, and what comes up very clearly immediately is a very large ditch. You can see that sort of dark brown area, which is an Iron Age ditch, and then a number of graves. And all in all, we've got about 60 graves from the site. You can see them a little bit better here as they're being excavated. You can see that they're a little bit higgledy-piggledy. They're not following a sort of a clear and coherent orientation. Some of them are aligned to each other. Some of them are aligned to the ditch. Some of them are aligned to other things. And this is something that I can talk about in a moment. Here's a plan that helps you, I think, perhaps see spatially how the site works. The graves seem to respect the lines of that ditch. That was a feature that was recognizable in the landscape when people were burying their loved ones here. And they seem to be on the north and on the east side of that ditch. There's some graves that we've marked here in red as Roman. That's still really to be determined, because the preliminary chronological evidence that we have that comes from carbon-14 dating suggests that we don't actually have anything that's late Roman. We thought we did, because we have a typology of graves that would be familiar in a late Roman context, such as this. So it would be incredibly typical for a late Roman burial in Cambridgeshire and in the south of England generally to have this sort of stone-lined grave. And so when this came up, we did think, oh, well, that's quite interesting. We really want to see what the actual date of this individual is. And there are a couple of them that follow this typology of graves. But as it stands, the carbon-14 suggests that they are contemporary with the other graves. So we've only had a very limited suite at this point of carbon-14 dating, but we're looking at things that are really, for the most part, in the first half of the 6th century, neatly in the first half up to the middle of the 6th century. One of the other chronological indicators that we use is the artifacts that come with graves. One of the things that's very, very well studied and well known about early medieval graves in Britain is the degree to which, at least in this period, so end of the 5th and up to the late 6th century, there's a lot of grave goods that people use. And this is something that we'll talk about a little bit more. Why should people do it? And what are the grave goods that people are putting with their loved ones? But because this is such a consistent practice, we've got a very good sense of the chronology of the grave goods that people use. And so we can really kind of position our individuals within the time frame using those. So here you're seeing someone who's buried in an earthen grave. Here you can see the limits of the grave cut around on the side, and you can see the position of the bones, which show you that this individual was dressed when she went into the ground. So she has brooches that were at her shoulders, and she has a string of beads that went between them. And then there's a couple of other little bits there. Here's some of the objects as they're coming out, some of the beads here, and some of the copper alloy objects. So we're looking at individuals who are buried in clothing. And that in itself is something that's quite interesting for us to think about. Here are some of the other things. I'm showing you an X-ray of this cruciform, cross-form brooch, which again is something that's really quite typical of the first half of the 6th century in England. These really big copper alloy brooches, I mean, they're huge brooches that have little animal faces on the ends. You can kind of see these zoomorphic shapes of little eyes and teeth and tusks and things like that, some much more evident than others. But here's an image showing how that worked. These brooches are usually things that women wore. It's quite interesting. This form, this cruciform brooch, is something that in its sort of origins was a late Roman military brooch that closed a cloak over a general's, a sort of high-ranking military official's garments. But over time and at the sort of end of the breakdown of the Roman Empire, it became a marker of status in a whole bunch of different contexts, and not only for men and not only for military men. So by the time we get to the early 6th century, we see it as a common part of women's dress, not only in what is now England, but also in parts of the continent, where it holds things together. It might hold an outer cloak together, but it goes in concert with a number of other things, like brooches that hold the shoulders of the dress together, and wrist clasps. We can talk about those too. So because these things are so common, as I say, we've got a very good sense of their chronology and their regional spread. So I've put a star here to show you where Cambridge is, but I'm showing you a distribution map of where cruciform brooches, so brooches of this type, are found. And we are looking very much at ours is a phase C type of brooch. And so we could look for parallels for this type of brooch in these kinds of sites. East Anglia, yeah, Fenland, that area. So Cambridge is sort of towards the south of that wider area that is a concentration. There's a real density of settlement sites and of burial sites of the first half of the 6th century in these areas. Now here's another example of one of our individuals. This one buried both with glass. This is what we call a claw beaker, this really spectacular piece of glass I'll show you in detail in a moment. And then an iron boss here. We've got a couple of iron bosses. There's one there that you're seeing. And this is a male, this is most probably a male individual. Sexing skeletons is a fine art, and it's without doing aDNA on every individual, you won't know for certain whether you're talking about someone who's biologically male or biologically female. But using measurements of different parts of the skeleton allows you to make usually it's quite clear. There's a lot of sort of fuzzy bits in the middle where it's not entirely clear that it's a male or a female. And this is important because we don't want to assume that somebody who's buried with a shield and a spear is necessarily a man. We want to look for the biological indicators of the person's sex and then hypothesize about what the significance of the grave goods of the individual might be. But I want to build up a picture here of just how rich these burials are and just how many questions we want to ask of the things that come out of this site. Here's that claw beaker that is again, this form is something that we see a fair amount of in 6th century British contexts. The type of glasswork seems to be derived from a late Roman metal or glass vessel that had little dolphins sort of on the bottom. And this is some sort of echo of that down many generations and many centuries later, and often using recycled glass, so recycled from Roman contexts, which gives it that kind of recycled glass color. Here, yes, you can see it spinning around. This is in the conservator's lab when it was being cleaned and reassembled. So it's worth thinking for a moment about where we are, where the Croft Gardens site sits in relation to Cambridge and what we know about early medieval life in Cambridge after the Roman period, and other sites that we might use as comparisons. So here I'm showing you a map of Roman Cambridge. And what will be clear, I think, from the get-go is that it's nowhere near where this cemetery is. It's nowhere near even where we are here. So Roman Cambridge was over around the site of Castle Hill. We assume that there was a fortification around it, or it was fortified in the 4th century. There were some traces of that, all of which has been obliterated by the 19th century development of Castle Hill and Chesterton and all of that. And we've got some sense of the Roman period burial areas being outside that city. Now that's a completely conventional, standard feature of Roman cities is that the dead aren't buried within Roman cities. They're always buried outside, often some considerable distance outside. And so the burials that we have, you can see them in those hatched marks, are some considerable distance outside the limits of the Roman town. But we've also got other indicators of industrial production, so pottery wasters. That means that there's a sort of factory of people making pottery, and that's located outside the town. So Roman Cambridge spread. It was concentrated in the area right there that was walled in Castle Hill, but it also spread beyond that with different kinds of activities. And there's Roman period farming that goes all the way up. Well, the new developments at Eddington, the sort of new expansion of the university towards the west and to the north, has revealed quite a lot of late Roman farming settlements, sites that are occupied in the 4th century, all the way up there. So it's not as though Roman Cambridge happened just inside that walled city, but there was a real distinction between what was urban and what was not. And our burial ground is really quite some distance away from those sites. We've got some other hints about where people were living and what they were doing in the early Middle Ages in Cambridge. Some that comes from King's. When the Garden Hostel building was expanded in the 1990s, same kind of thing, right? If you're going to build a big building, you need to assess the likelihood of finding archaeological remains, and indeed archaeological remains were found. And there's about 18 individuals that come from the site of the new Garden Hostel, and they were scientifically excavated and studied. They had the same kind of things, right? Here we've got bone combs, and we've got buckles, and we've got spindle whorls, so from weaving, that come from these graves that were at King's Garden Hostel. And about the same time as King's Garden Hostel was being excavated, the Criminology building was being built on Sidgwick site, and they likewise found not graves, but found traces of settlement. So they found huts where people lived, dating from the ~6th to the 7th centuries. There's a lot of fluidity around the dating here, or we sort of say 5th, 6th, early 6th, that sort of thing. It's very difficult to get very, very precise dating, partially because of the calibration curve that we use to correct our dates for radiocarbon, partially because we've got kind of classes of materials that fall into bands of chronological likelihood rather than really individual specific dates. So we're hovering around the 6th century for this kind of occupation. So it's worth then just thinking about what people knew or thought about Cambridge and its relationship to its Roman past and who these people were that were living here. So I'm giving you here a passage, and I'll just read it out. So monks who were looking for a stone for a sarcophagus for Ethelthryth, the sainted abbess and former queen, monks from Ely got into a boat, for the district of Ely is surrounded on all sides by waters, sorry, that's my typo, sorry, and marshes, and has no large stones, and came to a small deserted fortress not far away, which is called Grantechester in English, which is usually taken to mean Cambridge, not Grantchester. And near the walls of the fortress, they soon found a coffin, beautifully made of white marble with a close-fitting lid and the same stone. Realizing that the Lord had prospered their journey, they brought it to the monastery. And so here's Bede. He's writing in Northumbria in 720s, 730s. Has he ever been to Cambridge? No. Has he ever been to Ely? No. Does he have any idea really what he's talking about? No. There's a lot of this which is his construct of the correct and divinely guided work of the monks at Ely, and of the appropriate veneration given to a Christian ruler. Bede really puts an enormous amount of value in the distribution, the spread of Christianity in Britain that happens from Augustine's mission to Canterbury, but then happens through the sort of top-down network of kings. Bede is an important source, and Bede has given a framework and a shape for people for understanding this period of early medieval Britain for centuries. And here where we stand in the 21st century, there's a lot of other approaches that we can use. We don't have to shape our questions around the paradigms, the frameworks, the significance of Christianization, the significance of kings and queens, or monasteries and abbots and monks that Bede did. So it's important to kind of counterbalance, I think, what the narrative that we received from Bede with the kinds of things that are emerging from the ground. I wanted to stress this by reminding you that Bede gave a narrative of the migrations, right? He gave a narrative of Britain being essentially abandoned by the Romans and then repopulated with migrants that come from very specific parts of the non-Roman continent. And that it was totally straightforward. There was a group of people who came from one part of the Saxons, for instance, and that they settled in a very specific part of what is now England. And likewise with the Jutes, and likewise with the Angles. And it was all completely straightforward. It was like they had a memo, everyone got it, they all picked up their houses and their swords and everything else, and then they marched and they settled in this completely empty island that is what we now know as England. And this suited Bede's narrative, right? This was an important, for Bede, things before the middle of the 5th century were essentially a past that is entirely disconnected from his own. And it was important for him to kind of stress the foreignness of these individuals and their non-Christian nature, because that fit into his wider paradigm about the Adventus Saxonum, and then the formation of the English peoples with this reintroduction of Roman Christianity that happens with the Gregorian mission. So what do we think now in 2022 about the Adventus Saxonum and the migration of people to this island? Well, we have to put it in a much, much wider context, right? The movement of peoples from the continent to England are part of a much wider pattern of movements of people across Western Eurasia that start already in the 3rd century and that go, well, you know, there are some who say, and my last lecture for the early medieval British history paper, which is on the Vikings, suggests that the Scandinavian diaspora and the Viking movement is kind of the last in that long, long history of movement of people all around Western Eurasia. And these kinds of maps are, again, a little bit facetious. They imply that the Huns all got together and they moved in unison, sort of in a single file line into the territories of the Roman Empire. And it didn't really work that way. One of the things that people think more about this is that there were frontier zones of people on the edges of the Roman Empire who had done business with, who had traded with, who had skirmished with, who had married and had children together for centuries before the barbarian invasions actually began. And I think there's some usefulness to remembering how this might help us kind of understand what's going on in Britain. And it's also, I think, quite important to remember that there's movement from the continent into Britain, into England, what we call now England. But there's also movement from Ireland and what's now Scotland into what's England. So there's a huge amount of movement at sort of small scale levels and at very, very, very large scale levels. This is a period of enormous shifting and moving and sifting out of different populations and different ways of life. So how do we see that in the archaeological record? Well, one of the things that we can see is how people buried their dead. And so one of the things that we see about the first wave of migrations from the continent into Britain in the 5th century is the appearance of cremation burials, which is something that's very closely associated with North Sea and Northern European traditions being brought to what is now England. And this map, I hope, makes clear that we've got cremation cemeteries, which are the circles, lots and lots of them in East Anglia, lots and lots of them in that sort of area of kind of fenland there in the north. And then we get these inhumation cemeteries, which are the squares, and they happen in different parts of the world. And we can kind of chase a transformation in burial practice away from cremations at the end of the 5th century towards mixed and then towards inhumations. So this is a kind of, I don't know, mixing of burial traditions that happens, that forms early medieval societies of Britain. And there are 2 new techniques that are emerging in the past 20 or 30 years that really, really help us to think about these things. And those are stable isotope analysis and ancient DNA that we can do on the human remains of individuals. So stable isotope analysis, there are a couple of different ways in which you can do this. What I'm showing you here is carbon and nitrogen stable isotope analysis, which tends to speak to the diets of individuals who are buried. And what I'm wanting you to see in this plot is the difference between Roman diet and early Anglo-Saxon diet. Right, and early Saxon is a really sort of broad chronological term here. It's not referring to a really specific biographical, biological ethnic identity. So there is no continuity between what people ate, how they found food for themselves from the Roman period into the early Saxon period. And then there is a sort of a shift to more familiar patterns of food provision that happened in the Middle Saxon and sort of later medieval period, so later part of the first millennium than had happened earlier. And so what does that mean? One of the things that we can see in the early Saxon period is lots more fish, saltwater and freshwater fish. And we can see this sort of marker of so different commodities, different strategies of food sourcing happened in the Roman period from the early Saxon period. We could think about, when we look at plant remains, we can also think about more foraging, more berries, more sort of wild fruits, rather than cultivated foods. If we look at aDNA, this is something that's changing really, really very rapidly. I'm showing you something that was published in 2017, so it's already a little bit out of date because the technologies are changing really significantly and really quickly here. But just as a very, very broad picture of what we can understand here, I'm showing you, this is a plot that shows modern populations. And it shows groups of modern populations that sort of cluster into haplotypes. And here are some early medieval samples from what is now England and their relationship to those patterns. And so they cluster around in that green section, which is English, Estonian, Finnish, French, Georgian, German, Greek, Hungarian, modern populations. Now, it could be that the modern populations are shaped by those 6th century samples, which are what we're looking at here. It could also be that there is a sort of coherent group of people who have been living in these areas over time. You can see here the break between the Roman samples and the early medieval samples, right? You can see that they fall into different haplogroups here. And this is something that's really worth kind of contemplating. Remember, we're looking at clumps of data, clumps of modern data compared to ancient data. So that's already a methodological issue that one wants to contemplate. But we are identifying with the samples that come from these red sites, the samples that come from early medieval graves in these areas. We are seeing a real distinct emerging genetic profile of the people who are buried here. So they're not wholly migrant, and they are not wholly leftover Roman Britons who are lying in the ground here, but we're looking at something which is distinct. Now, I'm going to give you a few points here of what Katie wanted to talk to you about. And she wanted to help you think here about some of the individual cases and the individual case studies that we can think about. So she's thinking about this person who's buried with a very large cruciform brooch here, and who's got these wrist clasps that held her garment together at her wrist. I've got an example of a wrist clasp that I can show you here. And this gives us some really fine-grained detail and data about populations, isotopes, about sort of wider populations, but also fine-grained detail about individuals. And so one of the things that I think Katie is very interested in pursuing is an understanding of the biography of individuals, and what their skeleton with the associated graves that were in their goods that were in their grave can tell us about the life story of individuals, about their relationship to each other on the site, and how the objects that were placed alongside them in the grave relate to their loved ones and to them. We come really face to face with individuals when we look at individual grave narratives and grave stories. And this then helps us think about issues like gender and ethnicity in that context. She also wants to remind us that we should think about the cemetery as a collective place of burial, that starting in the very end of the 5th century, there was the first burial at Croft Gardens, and then people would return to this site over and over and over again for at least 3 generations to bury their dead here. So we are looking at a community that has been preserved in this cemetery. We don't know where they live. We've got no really good evidence for the settlement at the site, but we can see a statement of belonging and of continuity here for this community. So let's look at a couple of individuals here. Here is grave 18. This is a male who's aged between 30 and 35. There's a very, very large grave cut, right? He was buried in a very, very large hole. So there's a considerable investment in digging the grave for this individual. There are a couple of stones that line his grave, that's true. And there is a very large shield boss there. So he was buried holding his shield and holding that spear, or it's the tip of a lance is really what we're talking about, that piece of metal up at the top. And it may, in fact, actually be it's this one. Yeah, that's his. Let's think a little bit about how these work, right? So he's got objects of military function. He's got objects that perhaps he used in his life, and if he lived a military life, it's not entirely clear. One of the things that we can see when we look at the analysis of his skeleton is that he did quite a lot of heavy lifting in his life. There's osteoarthritis in the middle of his spine, so he probably felt an ache when he got up in the morning from using his back. There's developed muscle attachment, so what that means is that he's worked his muscles quite a lot. Bodybuilders have marks on their bones where the muscles have been attached to the bones, and so these are activities that are associated with quite a lot of heavy use of his body, as it were. His teeth have hypoplasia. That means they've got sort of little rings in his teeth, which suggest periods of malnutrition in childhood. So there might have been years in which he didn't have quite a lot to eat as a child, and those have left signs in his skeleton, in his body. One of the immediate neighbors to this grave, we've been looking at grave 18, and if we look at grave 19, we can see another man who is also buried with similar kinds of grave goods. So a knife, a spearhead, a shield. The graves are only very slightly intercutting, which means that people probably remember digging that very huge grave for the person who's buried in 18, and they didn't interrupt it. They sort of moved over to the side. We don't have headstones here. We don't have sort of markers that people identified their grave, but we nonetheless suspect that people really did know and remember who was buried where they were. And so there's probably a really good sense that number 19 is wanting, or the people who are burying number 19 are wanting to bury him next to number 18. And we can keep going. We can look at, so here's the locations of people who are buried with their spearheads, right? So these are mostly males who are buried with spearheads. And that there's a chronology of spearheads, but look at that little cluster of 17, 18, 19, and 20 who are there. And the chronology of the spearheads falls all sort of quite closely, except for 20. He's added a generation or so later. What does this mean? What does this tell us about the individual, right? That 18 was an anchor for a cluster of burials around that site. We could look at DNA, a different kind of DNA analysis that would allow us to determine family relationships. And we could surmise that maybe there's a family relationship in all of these men who are being buried next to each other. But one of the things we really have to think about is the transmission and memory of this community around that individual. What do they think that they're doing? It's hard to know, but we've got 3 generations of people who are clustered around the same grave at one location. Now, we can think a little bit more about other people here. I'm just going to run really quickly through this individual. So she's a woman who's buried, she's aged about 45. We've got a range of objects. There's 2 cruciform brooches, a pair of wrist claps on both wrists. There's a buckle. There's a huge spread of beads. And these objects suggest a really early date. So maybe end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th century. So contemporary to 18, right? So then we start to understand who was alive at the same time. We can reconstruct the costume of this person. Here's, you can see the brooches, and you can see the cruciform brooch. And here's a kind of image that we can use to imagine what this person would have, what her attire would have looked like. The wrist clasps and the brooches that are holding this item of dress together. She's relatively tall compared to some of the other women at the site. Maybe this is an indicator of high status. Maybe she had a better diet than some of the other people at the site. Her brooches are the heaviest copper alloy objects in female graves. So this is a material investment in the commemoration of an individual at a time of enormous fluctuation and change. And she is a woman of a certain age. Is her status associated with her age as having born children, having born important children, having been a leader in the community? These are questions that we want to think about. She's also buried in a specific place, right? So there's her grave. And so it's in a very specific section of the cemetery in relation to those big Iron Age ditches. In that western area of the cemetery, we've only got adult women and children. And apart from number 1, they're mostly poorly furnished. So it's not necessarily a prestigious zone. It might be exactly the opposite. And so there's what we're beginning to understand here is that there's a variety of ways in which women's graves are treated and women's bodies are being treated in this community. Now, just to wrap up, I'm going to move really quickly. I want to show you here. So here's the women and children who are buried in area 1. They're yellow because it's very difficult to tell the sex of a juvenile skeleton. So we can tell their age, but we really don't, until you get sort of past puberty, you don't really get a lot of indicators of sex in terms of the skeleton. But there's the kind of spread overall of the clusters of men and women in the community. I want to just remind you, we looked a little bit about where Roman Cambridge was. And so there's a big circle of where we are right now. But these are the other places that graves of the early medieval period have been found around Cambridge. And you'll notice that not all, but the majority of them are on the west side of the camp. There's definitely a river community here, mostly on the west, separate from where the Romans were. And that goes on, that carries up into North Stowe, it carries up into Oakington, where we've got quite a lot of graves from the 6th century. And so what we want to think about here is whether Rome and Cambridge actually mattered very much to these people. What matters, it seems, is the river and the communities that are living here on the river. You'll see St. John's playing fields, Girton, they have a number of finds that come from the early medieval period, but they were excavated in the 19th century. So they weren't stratigraphically excavated. And so they're very difficult to do this kind of fine-grained work with. And I'm going to just mention very briefly that one of the things that Katie's very interested in is the beads and thinking about who made beads in these sites and what they can tell us about people like Grave 1, who had a huge collection of beads, all from different makers, or many from different makers. And was she collecting beads from other women in the community? Was she, did she just happen to love beads? Is that we don't know the answers to these questions, but when Katie starts doing really fine detailed analysis of what the bead craftsmanship was, and tracing the different makers of beads, Katie is hoping that that's going to be able to reveal patterns of commercial connections, who was trading beads with whom along these west of the river settlements, or even beyond, and to help us then draw connections between this site and others. And here's just a reminder of the number of different sites in Cambridgeshire and around that have burials of this early medieval period. Again, some of them excavated more systematically than others. The real joy of this site is the precision with which it was excavated that allows us to ask these really, really fine-grained questions. But we've got a big landscape that we can relate this site to. So I'm going to close with that and ask if you've got any questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I wonder if there's any forms of deafening.
Well, so it's sometimes you get signs of death. We do not have a huge number here. We don't have anyone who's been whacked with a sword in a catastrophic way or those kinds of things. And sometimes you do get those. But no, we've actually got a college research associate who's really interested in looking at cancer. He works on cancer in prehistoric populations, and he's very interested in thinking about whether he could see signs of cancer in this cemetery. But no, we don't have a huge amount of it. That's one of the kind of challenges when you're looking at a archaeological cemetery, is that there's a sort of paradox of you see the people, you very rarely see the people who you see them when they're dead, right? And it's very hard to see what they lived with. People are developing new techniques to try and work around that, like looking for changes in the sort of cycles of bone growth and looking to see whether you can see episodes of illness that people have recovered from. But you either see people dying of old age, or you see people dying of a sort of quite sudden and quick illness that may or may not leave traces. We get some signs of anemia. I mean, people had quite a lot of parasites and diarrhea in this period, but whether or not they actually died of it, it's hard to see. Sorry, there was one question here. Yeah? We'll get you next.
Surely in the past, people died much longer. Still really quite and in the last couple of years. And they died of infectious disease.
Yeah.
To a great extent, which wouldn't
see.
Well.
That's right. Well, some would and some wouldn't, right? So things that go septic, you can see if there's bone marrow preserved. So one of the things I'm really interested in is whether or not the bubonic plague affected this population, because we certainly know that the Justinianic plague, which happened in Constantinople in the middle of the 6th century, and carries on into, it spreads across the Mediterranean and arrived in England in the middle of the 6th century. I'd be really interested to know if it affected these people. And because that disease goes septic, you can see it in DNA. Say again? Yes. Or history of cholera, I don't know. I don't think that there is cholera in Britain in the early Middle Ages. Yes. Yes, that certainly. Yes, right.
Very early on, you showed us a slide of a skeleton without grave goods.
Yes.
I noticed it was aligned east to west.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether there is any possibility here of evidence of surviving Christianity pre-Augustine.
Right. That's an excellent question, and very deftly noted, the orientation of the skeleton as well. There's very little evidence of 4th century Christianity in Cambridgeshire. Indeed, in all of Britain. I mean, there is some, there's Lullingston Roman Villa has some paintings which people usually interpret as the Cairo, as the sort of as indicators of Christianity of the community. But there's very, very little of it. I mean, surprisingly little of it, which to me speaks to the degree to which 4th century Britannia was already really quite removed from the wider trends of the Roman Empire in that period. It's not to say there weren't Christians in Britain, and we certainly know from there's a hagiographic count of Saint-Germain-d'Auxerre who comes to Britain and meets Christian communities in Britain. There certainly were Christians here, but it's very, very infrequent that people interpret east-west graves, especially east-west graves in a kind of remote place like this as a marker of Christianity. So good question. I don't think so.
I know that people regard it as a very exciting topic.
Yeah.
And there may have been Christian burials slightly later, perhaps at St. Martin's in the Fields in London.
Yeah.
But I'm not confident enough about dates and things to be able to engage with you properly on it.
Well, so therein again is our real challenge. We can do carbon-14 with a certain amount of precision, but the 4th and the 5th century are very, very flat in terms of the calibration curve because of the activities of the sun at the time. And so you just get these sort of clumps of dates that don't allow an enormous amount of precision. But you're absolutely right. It's a very interesting topic. Yeah. So I've got a question here.
Whether you have to take account of soil movement when you're looking at graves. I noticed that some of the skeletons are very differently positioned from other ones. And was that just soil movement, or were there different ways that people had of putting people in graves?
No, the orientation
was on the side.
Yeah, so that person was laid into the grave on the side, yes. So when you say soil movement, yes, archaeologically, we normally talk about that in terms of the taphonomic processes. So was the individual buried in an open casket or in a closed casket? I mean, were they buried just in the earth or were they buried in a casket? Those things are completely recognizable in terms of analysis of the skeleton. So there are certain things that the human skeleton does when it's decomposing in an open space that's different from when it's when it's surrounded by earth when it decomposes. And so all of those factors are fairly kind of conventional archaeological questions that the excavators determine when they're finding the individual.
On the side, was there much movement?
So by movement, were there many people who were buried in a casket? No. The majority of people who were buried in the ground and were covered over with earth. They were positioned in different orientations. So some are on their back, some are on their sides, and some have their legs flexed and some have their legs stretched out. That was the decision of the people who buried the individuals, not movement of the earth.
But you might have fluvial movement.
You might have fluvial movement, not sufficient at this rate.
In this place, no.
No, to move these people, no.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Is there, or will there be a consolidated exhibition of what was found at Croft Gardens?
That's an excellent question. Not at the moment. I mean, Katie has 4 years to do a research fellowship on these individuals. And I think it would be a great thing to imagine not only showing what's here, but also what came from the 19th century excavations at Girton and at St. John's Playing Fields. There is a commemorative exhibition about Cyril Fox happening in 2023. So in the anniversary of his publication of the Archaeology of the Cambridge region. And there will be some Anglo-Saxon material there, and to be determined whether anything from King's Croft Gardens goes into that. Again, Cyril Fox was not an early medievalist, so it's not exclusively on the early medieval period. It's a good idea. There's not one planned at the moment, but I think it'd be a lot of fun. Yes. Yes.
I take it from what you said that the cruciform nature of the brooches doesn't indicate any connection with Christianity.
No, not at all. Not at all. If there's a question behind, yeah.
I noticed when you were showing the graves, there were great swathes of Cambridgeshire who don't have any graves. Is that because you haven't looked, or was it underwater at the time?
That's an excellent question. You know, we know about places that people have found things, right, as it were. So when Baron von Huygen is digging around Croft Gardens and finds little bits, well, then it gets flagged in the Historic England record. And then people start going back and looking for more. So there's a way in which one kind of random identification of a site will then provoke further study and analysis. And certainly since 1996, where a lot of what we know about England is shaped by where people have built Tesco's and railways and car parks and swimming pools and new accommodation for university students. That has absolutely shaped our understanding of the archaeological record. And there's a real concern, I think, about this. So where is the majority of digging, and where's the majority of new property development happening in England? Well, it's in the Southeast. So do we know more about the early medieval period in the Southeast? Yes. Is that because there were more people living in the Southeast? Question mark. So there's quite a lot of work that one needs to do to kind of tease out the biases that are in the archaeological record. Yeah. Yes.
What happened to these? What happened to the skeletons and remains from Garden Hostel, and what will happen to the stuff from here?
So the way it works is that they are the property of the county, and the ones that are from Garden Hostel are in the county store, which is in an abandoned salt mine in Bedfordshire, to provide a climate-controlled environment, and that's where these guys will go to. And that doesn't mean that they're sort of forgotten about. You can, I mean, there is an archive, and so you can call them up and take them out, and with the agreement of the council, county, do further research on them.
These things won't be in a museum or theater.
No, that's not the plan at the moment. No, human remains fall under a slightly different category than other objects, small finds, and these sorts of things. We at the moment don't have an appropriate exhibition space at King's for that sort of thing. There is the MAA, that's entirely true, but it likewise does a huge number of things, like from Polynesia to Cambridgeshire. So no, I think most likely these things will stay in the archive. What we will do, and which Katie is taking really seriously, is making them available in terms of online discussions and reproductions and information. There's quite a lot of the school kids at Newington Croft were really interested in what was coming up in the site, and so there's a packet of material that we're thinking about giving to primary school teachers in the area to sort of think about what they can do with it. This material comes up on a certain amount of school curriculum, and I think we could improve that by using specific examples that come from this excavation. But question mark. Well, it won't get buried. It'll be put in an appropriate archival box. But yes, yeah, I think that's probably right. Unless we decide to kind of reconfigure the chapel museum in a way that would give space to this, that would be something to be done. But that's not on the table at the moment.
One of your earlier slides showed the change in diet from early Saxons to Middle Saxons. It wouldn't be because the early Saxons were near the coast and the Middle Saxons were further inland, would it, that they had less fish?
It could be. It also has to do with greater intensification of what they're farming. One of the things that's very clear about the Middle Saxon period is that there is a real concentration of nucleated settlements in which people live in hamlets and villages and concentrate their farming efforts. This is something that's usually referred to as the rise of the manor, right, that goes up into the 9th century. There's a reorganization of the way people live in Britain. It's not just about close to or away from the coast. It also has to do with the introduction of nitrogen fixing crops like millet and sort of different things that people are eating. Those two shape the isotopic record. One of the things that's really fascinating about fish, not so much about this period, but of the 10th and 11th century, is that fish comes back in a really big way in England. And there's one of the colleagues in the archaeology division has identified what's called the fish event horizon. And yeah, exactly. There is a moment in the end of the 10th century, beginning of the 11th century, where people are eating marine fish in quantities that is completely unprecedented. And it's prestigious. And so they're eating eel and it's prestigious. They're eating preserved fish and it's prestigious. And it has to do, well, on the long term, it has to do with the wealth that's generated from that process of intensification that happens in the Middle Saxon period, bearing fruit, and there's a conspicuous consumption of fish in the late Anglo-Saxon period. So that it is like it is remarkable. It's very visible in the human record. It's very visible in the archaeological record as well. So fish come back for sure.
Could you just say anything about the rest of the site? I'm obviously concentrated on the graves, but there were some fairly conspicuous other things on it.
Well, you say that. There was a sort of clump of what was thought to be an Iron Age structure, and that when excavated actually was really, really difficult to understand, in part because of the buildings that came and sat on top of it. I mean, in the nature of, so commercial excavation has a sort of, you essentially excavate everything systematically. It's not that they only focused on the graves because they're more interesting. It's because they excavated everything, because you have to record everything because you're going to put a building right on top of it. So yes, I'm more interested in the graves that came out of this site. That's true. But the possible Iron Age hut that's a little bit further to the south of that ditch that was there on the plan, it was incredibly difficult to interpret and not actually that significant in terms of remains. So there's a kind of question mark that hovers over that.
I think you implied at the beginning when you were talking about the Romans that they tended to put their graveyards at a distance from the habitation. Yeah. So presumably if that tradition went on, you'd be looking elsewhere anyway.
For where people lived? Yes. So there's a real challenge that we have in trying to understand early medieval settlement. This intensification of farming that I was just talking about is something that we see in the documentary record and not in the archaeological record. We can see it in terms of charters and property documents, but we can't really see it in terms of the archaeological record because people lived in timber huts. And timber huts are really tricky to find in the archaeological record, right? They don't show up. Metal detectorists don't find them. They don't show up in georadar or LiDAR surveys. They're even if you are the most careful excavator, you are finding little tiny holes, right, that have a slightly different colored soil inside them, which is the decomposed timber of the frame of a hut. It's very tricky archaeology, and in that I think is a quite important point. These people cared enormously about how they were burying their dead. So they put metal objects in the grave. They took items of personal use and put them out of circulation into people's graves. They didn't care so much about their houses. And they didn't put that kind of wealth and energy and material richness in their houses, as far as we can tell. Some churches they did, right? Stone-built churches, you can see those in the archaeological record, but houses you really don't. So we don't have great information about where people lived for the whole of the early medieval period in Britain, partially because I think they didn't put so much energy into how they built their houses. Yes. Yeah.
Was this men only? Was it a fashion? Was it status?
Well, we thought it was chronology, and I think we were wrong about that. I can't remember off the top of my head whether it divides only men and women. It's probably status. I mean, if you just sort of think about, like, you know, the introduction to archaeology, how many man hours does it take to produce this grave, right? Heaving stones around and lining the empty hole with them is an effort and expenditure of man hours that's greater than not using stones. So there's some expression of status there. I think you're right about that, but I don't know more than that. I don't know what to think more than that. This question behind.
Thank you. I wonder whether your research is in any way indicating the social basis of settlement and resource use, and whether you derive any evidence from contemporary research elsewhere in the world. The reason I ask is that I've been involved in research in Cambodia post-Khmer Rouge migration and settlement, which was sponsored as community natural resource management. Mm-hmm. But in practice, that was to some extent ideological on the part of the agencies concerned, who wanted to organize development on that basis. In practice, we found that it's a household which makes the decisions about land acquisition and subsequent use of resources and settlement.
Well, that's a very complex, that's a very good question, a very complex question. I think that so there are many, many, many ways to approach this part of the past. I think that Katie, who's principally responsible for the shape of the overall research project, is incredibly interested in the kinds of things that I've been talking about today. Family, status within the community, memory within the community, and social bonds within the community. There are other ways that other people might have approached this project. For instance, people could have suggested that we look at this cemetery in its wider landscape and do a geophysical survey of the entire area around the Barton Road in order to situate it in terms of what we can determine about other sites and settlements in that area, and think about land use, think about diet, think about these kinds of things. There was a competition that went with the awarding of the position for the research fellowship. The college decided to create a research fellowship, and then there was a competition for it. And Katie's project, as she proposed it, was the most attractive to the committee that was making the appointments. And it seemed the best fit for the data that we had, right? It seemed a really good way to maximize the materials that had come out of this site, to think about the relationship of the individuals who were buried here. You're entirely right. There is a sort of ideological and political aspect to doing this kind of research. And there's a way in which many people who are working in early medieval archaeology in Britain are very actively trying to sort of chuck bead out and do away with these master narratives of Christianization and royal power and authority, which have governed the study of the early medieval period, and think more about individuals, their lived experience, and the way that relates in terms of intersectional questions of gender status and authority within the community. So there's a political ideology associated with that, to be sure, but I think it's intellectually justified for sure, and it does allow us to really develop the research potential of this site in particular. You had a question.
Yes, I wondered how much DNA analysis is being done, and how you can, for example, look for wood or plant material for the coast, for example.
That's a very interesting question. People spend a lot of time thinking about human DNA and a little bit less thinking about the DNA of plants and animals. Although, to be fair, quite a lot of of DNA work is going into thinking about changing the sort of animals, domesticated animals, or I don't mean domesticated, but I mean animals like sheep that are being used for food. We don't have a lot of animal remains here, and we don't have a lot of plant remains either. So people have taken samples and floated them to try and find preserved plant remains and animal remains, but we really don't have very much. So no, that's not high on the list of things to work about. We do have some preserved, some mineralized bone and horn that come from some of the weapons. And so we can probably identify the wood or the bone and the horn for that. Beyond that, no, I don't think so. I think we are at our time limit, and you've got to move on to another reception. I'm really happy to stand here with these objects, and you can have a look as you walk out and answer any other questions if you'd like as you're moving on. Thanks very much for coming.